Landmark moment in American history. President Trump impeached on abuse of power and on obstruction of Congress. Speaker Nancy Pelosi saying the president, quote, gave us no choice. Republicans defending the president, saying there was no evidence of a crime, and accusing the Democrats of wanting to do this since the day he was elected.
Now, let me tell you what just went down in the United States Senate, something the White House clearly hopes to keep under wraps. Behind the polished image of a president who seems to have a firm grip on his party, Trump was in full-blown scramble mode. He was making furious phone calls, venting on social media, and agreeing to deals he previously swore he wouldn't touch. The reason Republican senators were starting to turn against him, this wasn't just a couple of moderates murmuring their concerns like usual. It was 5 Republican senators making noise. Recently, some surprising events unfolded in the Senate that really put President Trump on the defensive. A handful of Republican senators actually teamed up with Democrats to vote against his ability to launch military actions without needing the go-ahead from Congress.
We told you about that war powers resolution that is being voted on today, that is being pushed by Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, who is calling on this to go through from his colleagues. It would limit the president's ability to move American forces and attack into Venezuela.
These senators took a hard look at Trump's behavior, including his outrageous threats to grab Greenland from an ally and his aggressive stance on Venezuela, and thought, no way, this is reckless. They decided to use their constitutional power to put a stop to it. The vote was incredibly close, so close that Vice President J.D. Vance had to dash into the Senate chamber to break a tie, which was 50-50. It's wild to think that Trump faced a bipartisan pushback against his military plans, and just one vote made all the difference between a significant setback for him and avoiding a humiliating moment where his own party would have voted to take away war powers he saw as crucial to his presidency.
How much money are you thinking of giving people in Greenland to get them on board with a possible U.S.
I'm not talking about money for Greenland yet. I might talk about that. But right now, we are going to do something on Greenland, whether they like it or not, because if we don't do it, Russia or China will take over Greenland, and we're not going to have Russia or China as a neighbor.
What prevented that from happening was an intense last-minute pressure campaign from the White House, which managed to sway 2 of the 5 Republican senators who had initially supported the measure.
Tonight, the firestorm over Greenland is growing after the White House declared Greenland should be part of the U.S. Tonight, some key Republicans on the Hill pushing back, one senator calling this amateur hour, saying, quote, that is absurd. Secretary of State Marco Rubio now says President Trump wants to buy Greenland. So how would that work? Rachel Scott at the White House.
So here's the deal. We've seen a pretty clear shift in how some Republican senators are acting lately, especially concerning their relationship with Trump. For years, Trump kept a tight grip on the party, mainly through fear. Senators worried about primary challenges, nasty posts on social media, and losing support from the MAGA crowd. Even when they knew his decisions were questionable or felt uncomfortable with his behavior, their fear often outweighed their principles. But something's changing. The recent war powers vote is a prime example of this. 5 Republican senators, including folks like Josh Hawley and Todd Young, definitely not your typical liberal types, actually voted against Trump on a big national security issue.
Senator Josh Hawley is one of 5 Republican senators who voted in favor of that resolution.
If the president and the Department of War should feel the need to put ground troops, boots on the ground into Venezuela in the future, then I think under the Constitution, Congress would need to vote on that.
They put their names on the line and faced the backlash from the White House and social media. Even though 2 of them eventually caved and changed their votes, the fact that they were willing to defy Trump at all shows cracks in the fear-based control he once had. And it wasn't just that vote. Around the same time, the Senate was also in a pretty heated battle over funding for the Department of Homeland Security. This whole showdown revealed even more issues with Trump's approach, particularly his strict immigration policies. The backlash from things like ICE raids and even tragic incidents like the shooting of Alex during one of those operations led some Republican senators to quietly suggest that Trump might need to rethink his tactics.
Donald Trump has suddenly changed his tune on immigration enforcement here in Minneapolis, even telling local officials that he was going to start pulling federal agents from the city. So why did that happen? Part of it has to do with the fact that more and more Republicans were speaking out against the ICE and Border Patrol tactics that they were seeing in the city after the killing of Alex Preddy on Saturday.
It's quite something, really, to see members of a party known for tough immigration stances pushing for a softer approach. It's quite the sight when you think about how everything unfolded recently with the political stakes getting higher. Trump found himself in a tight spot. The chatter behind closed doors was about pulling back his hardline stance because the repercussions were starting to outweigh the benefits. Things got serious when the threat of a shutdown for the Department of Homeland Security loomed over the horizon. This agency plays a crucial role in border security and immigration enforcement, and it was about to run out of money.
Another shutdown for parts of the federal government has begun as a fight over proposed restrictions on President Trump's immigration enforcement agenda drags on. Funding for the Department of Homeland Security expired on Saturday, and Democrats say they will not help approve more money until the new limits are placed on federal immigration operations after the fatal shooting of Alex Preddy and Renee Good.
In a surprising twist, Trump picked up the phone and called Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, the leading Democrat in the Senate. He actually worked out a deal to keep the government running and even opened discussions about placing new limits on federal immigration agents. Just let that sink in for a moment. This is Trump. We're talking about the president who established his entire political identity on being tough on immigration. He had always maintained he would never back down. Yet here he was negotiating limits on his own enforcement powers. This isn't typical behavior for a president who's got a tight grip on his party or agenda. It looks more like someone who's feeling the heat, realizing he's losing support among his own senators and needing to backtrack to avoid a major political disaster. Now, let's break down the details of how these events unfolded and what this means for Trump's presidency moving forward. When we dissect both Senate confrontations closely, it becomes clear just how precarious Trump's position is with his party. Let's begin with the war powers vote, as that's where the cracks in Republican unity showed up most clearly. In early January 2026, a bipartisan group of senators introduced a resolution concerning war powers directly aimed at two of Trump's heated foreign policy decisions. One involved his threats to use military force against Venezuela, and the other was related to his bold talks about using the military to take Greenland from Denmark, which is a NATO ally. This kind of rhetoric was so far outside the normal diplomatic playbook that it drew criticism from across the board. Even Republican Senator John Kennedy, who usually toes the party line, openly opposed the idea of invading a treaty ally. It's honestly hard to believe how far things have gone, especially when a Republican senator flat out called a presidential foreign policy goal weapons grade stupid. That's not the kind of language you expect to hear from a senator. And he wasn't the only one expressing discontent. Several Republicans, particularly those focused on NATO, strongly criticized the idea of a Greenland threat. They viewed it as a serious risk to an allied territory sovereignty and a possible catastrophe that could jeopardize the transatlantic alliance, which has been a foundation of American security since World War II. This backlash didn't just stop at words. It actually translated into votes. 5 Republican senators, Rand Paul, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Todd Young, and Josh Hawley, joined their Democratic colleagues to push forward the War Powers resolution. Although this vote was just a procedural step, it was hugely significant. It effectively put these 5 Republicans on the record as supporting limits on Trump's military authority. What's really interesting about this group is that it goes beyond the usual moderate wing you often hear about Collins and Murkowski, who typically get mentioned as the ones breaking ranks. This time we have Josh Hawley, who really positions himself as a strong populist conservative, and Todd Young, a military veteran who serves on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and takes national security very seriously. When you see senators with backgrounds like these willing to publicly oppose the president over war powers, it indicates a deeper discomfort within the Republican ranks, far beyond what's normally seen during domestic policy debates. The White House didn't take this lightly. Trump was quick to jump on social media to lash out at the Republicans supporting the resolution, insisting they should be ashamed for trying to strip him of his powers meant to protect the nation. The behind-the-scenes pressure was even more intense. Staff at the White House bombarded the offices of every Republican who backed the measure, making threats and promises in an effort to flip votes before the final tally. They had some success with this tactic. Hawley and Young, the two senators who initially surprised everyone by voting against the party line, eventually changed their votes under pressure and fell back in line for the final count. But even with their switch, the final tally ended up being deadlocked at 50-50, and it required the vice president to break the tie. So here's the scoop. There was this big moment when President Vance walked into the chamber to cast the tie-breaking vote, officially sealing the deal on killing the resolution. Earlier, there was a procedural vote that showcased some bipartisan support, coming in at 52-47. But even with the final tally, 3 Republicans stood firm against Trump's military authority, which really highlighted how shaky Trump's grip on the Senate is, especially when he pushes policies that many senators see as reckless and dangerous. At the same time, there was another major drama brewing with the DHS funding, and this one really laid bare the anxiety among Republicans about Trump's agenda. The immediate spark for this controversy was the tragic shooting of a gentleman named Alex Pretty during an ICE enforcement operation in Minnesota. This awful incident, where a man lost his life during an immigration raid, drew massive public outcry and put Trump's aggressive immigration strategies under an unforgiving lens. Surprisingly, it wasn't just the Democrats who were concerned. Republican senators, especially those who are eyeing re-election battles in 2026, were tuning into the fallout from the shooting and crunching the numbers. The polling data was clear, and the public's reaction was intense. They knew that being linked to immigration enforcement tactics that led to civilian casualties wasn't going to be a winning strategy at the polls. So when the DHS funding debate finally hit the Senate floor, it turned into a major standoff over the broader direction of Trump's immigration crackdown. The Democrats came into the negotiations with some pretty bold demands. They were pushing for strict limits on ICE raids, insisting that federal agents clearly identify themselves during enforcement operations instead of hiding behind anonymity. They also sought tighter rules on the use of force to stop more incidents like what happened in Minnesota. And here's the kicker. Some Republicans were actually sympathetic to those demands, not a whole lot of them, but just enough that passing a clean DHS funding bill without any immigration enforcement conditions became a real challenge. Republican senators who were worried about the backlash from the Minnesota shooting were discreetly telling their leaders that they needed to offer some concessions regarding enforcement. It's wild how things unfolded recently. So after some major raids, it became clear that a lot of Republicans were feeling the heat, not because they suddenly had a change of heart on immigration, but because the fallout from these raids was shaping up to be a political nightmare. They knew if things continued unchecked, people could really get hurt. That's when Trump decided to make a significant move, which honestly showed just how vulnerable he was compared to his usual tough guy image. Faced with the looming threat of the Department of Homeland Security shutting down and knowing he would take the blame for it, Trump picked up the phone and called Chuck Schumer. Yes, the president reached out to the Democratic leader of the Senate to strike a deal. They came to an agreement to fund the government and, crucially, to start serious discussions on putting new limits on federal immigration agents. This is the same Trump who built his reputation on being harsher than anyone else on immigration. He'd always claimed he wouldn't back down, labeling anyone who suggested a gentler approach as weak. Yet here he was, negotiating restrictions on his own immigration enforcement powers with someone he had often painted as a political enemy. Schumer even confirmed that Trump followed up to ensure everything was on track, acknowledging some growing dissatisfaction among Republicans, and indicated they'd be moving on to what he called Phase 2. More negotiations, more compromises, and undoubtedly more conflicts ahead. This phone call and the resulting deal was a significant retreat for a president who's always tried to project total strength on his cornerstone issue. It became evident that he was losing influence, especially with his own party members, on matters like war powers and immigration strategies. Facing the embarrassment of a shutdown would not look good for him at all. So he found himself in a position where he had to negotiate with those he had spent years vilifying. Now let's take a step back and reflect on the key takeaways from these twin Senate showdowns, because the implications stretch far beyond just one vote or one funding agreement. First off, the war powers vote showed that Trump's grip on Republican senators isn't as ironclad as it used to be. A notable chunk of his own party is now ready to stand up and publicly challenge him. It's honestly hard to believe how things have shifted lately, so 5 Republicans decided to break away and support a resolution that actually limits Trump's military authority. And get this, 2 of those Republicans folded under the pressure from the White House and changed their votes at the last minute. Even with that intense push, the final tally ended up being a tie at 50 votes each, which meant the vice president had to step in to break it. This tiny margin is pretty alarming for a president who is supposed to dominate the Senate with his party's majority. What's even more interesting is the mix of those who initially defected. You had populist conservatives like Josh Hawley standing alongside traditional moderates like Susan Collins. This shows that the willingness to diverge from Trump isn't confined to just one side of the party. It's spreading, and that should send shivers down the spine of the White House. If Hawley and Todd Young were ready to go against Trump once, even if they change their minds later due to pressure, it opens the door for more defections down the road. The precedent has been set, and next time around the pressure might not work quite as well, especially if Trump's approval ratings keep sliding and the political costs of sticking with him rise while the risks of breaking away become less daunting. Now let's talk about the Department of Homeland Security funding showdown. Trump's phone call with Chuck Schumer really highlighted how much his hold over Congress has weakened compared to his first term. Back then, he shut down the government for 35 days over funding for the border wall, daring the Democrats to flinch. He didn't mind taking the heat because he thought his base would have his back for standing firm. But this time, when there was a looming DHS shutdown and anxiety among Republicans about handling immigration enforcement, Trump was the one who blinked first. He called the opposing leader and was ready to discuss limits on his enforcement powers, something he had staunchly vowed not to do. This shows a president who's lost the political capital to push his agenda through stubbornness and threats. The fear factor that used to keep everyone in check is fading away. Once senators realize they can cross him without facing dire consequences, the apocalypse they've always been warned about, it makes it much tougher for the White House to use fear as a control tactic in future showdowns. Every concession he makes only weakens that grip further. Every time there's a new incident like that tragic shooting in Minnesota, it really shifts the political landscape and changes how Republican senators think about immigration. They're realizing that being too closely tied to Trump's hardline strategies, which lead to awful outcomes like family separations and harsh detention conditions, might not be great for their chances in the 2026 elections. They are fully aware that their opponents are going to run ads showcasing every controversial ICE action and every heartbreaking story resulting from enforcement going wrong. As they eye their re-election prospects, these senators see a real threat from suburban and independent voters who are crucial in close races. They won't be inclined to vote for someone who's backing a president whose immigration policies are facing serious backlash. This growing backlash is pushing Republican senators to negotiate instead of just going along with Trump, especially as the midterm elections heat up. They might not say it out loud due to the potential blowback from their base, but many of them privately acknowledge that the current approach to immigration just isn't sustainable. On another note, there's a combination of the immigration fight and other political dynamics like the ongoing war powers debate that's suggesting we're heading toward a situation where Trump encounters more organized and effective opposition from both sides of the aisle. Republican senators are starting to realize they hold independent constitutional power, and crossing Trump might actually be survivable for them. This situation is gradually building into something much more significant as they begin to see allies across the aisle willing to work with them. It's becoming pretty clear that Trump's hold on the Senate is starting to waver. I mean, if you look closely at the recent vote counts and the deal he had to make with Chuck Schumer, you can see the signs. 5 Republican senators decided to break away on the issue of war powers, which is a big deal. And the vice president had to step in to avoid a tie vote. It doesn't stop there. He even reached out to the leading Democrat and agreed to talk about limits on his own immigration enforcement. On top of that, some Republican senators are outright saying that his foreign policy ideas are downright ridiculous. Behind the scenes, there are more and more Republicans crunching the numbers for 2026 and figuring out that sticking by Trump might actually hurt their careers. Being blindly loyal to him is becoming a real political risk they can't afford. And here's where it gets interesting. The atmosphere of fear that used to keep the Republican caucus in line is starting to crack. With each controversial policy, every new scandal, and as Trump's approval rating takes more hits, the cracks are getting bigger. Each senator who dares to break with him and manages to come out unscathed is paving the way for others to do the same, making it that much easier for them. The Senate is waking up to its power, realizing that the checks and balances system still exists. And while Trump loves to stir things up with his posts and his bluster, it's becoming clear that fear alone isn't enough when the political landscape shifts. Today, they're tackling war powers and funding for the Department of Homeland Security, but tomorrow it could easily shift to oversight investigations or other serious issues. If a major crisis occurs, senators might have to choose between Trump and their commitments, and those coalitions built over policy disputes could realign around much larger implications. So, in a nutshell, the political dynamics are changing, and it's getting more complicated for Trump by the day. Things are definitely changing fast, and I can assure you there's so much more on the way. It's only going to get even wilder from here. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next